Hey everybody, Doc Brown here with another weekly Line 6 live stream. We're doing our weekly Podgo live here. I believe this is episode 8, and for this one we're going to get back to the basics a little bit. I'm going to be talking about how you just build a preset from scratch. So, of course, there's plenty of awesome tones preloaded into Podgo. There's presets for artists, there's presets for particular amps, particular genres, even songs. But sometimes, of course, you want to build your own tones. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to be hanging out on the Line 6 live stream, both on the Facebook and YouTube channels for about 30 minutes. And I'm just going to be taking you through building a basic preset in Podgo. Also, if you guys have any questions, feel free to sound off in the comments. I'll try and get to those as they come up here. And we also have some other product specialists hanging out in the chat today who may also answer your questions if I don't get to them first. But yeah, like I said, today we're going to be hanging out for a good half hour. We're going to be talking about Podgo, building presets, kind of how it's done, building your own presets, that is. And yeah, any other questions you have, feel free to sound off in the comments. Once again, it doesn't have to be just a Podgo question. If you have a Helix or an H2X question or Variax or Power Cab, feel free. But yeah, I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. How about that? So for starters, let's head over to our Podgo, and right now we're in the factory set list. So any of these presets in here can be overwritten, of course. Right now you see this one, it's called Sultans. Basically a Sultan's a swing sound. Oh, hey Tony, looks like we got a product specialist, Tony Campanovo, in the house. He'll be in the comments answering some questions as well. Thanks, Tony. But yeah, right now we're in the factory set list. These can be overwritten. Let's talk about how we can get to the user set list though, where there's just a whole bunch of blank presets for us to write and create at our heart's content. So in this view right now, this is kind of your performance view. You can see what each of these individual foot switches are controlling. Right now they're controlling your effects. I could hit the mode and I could switch presets, things like that. If I press my home or view button up here, that's going to take me into the editor view. So that's just a little bit of workflow of Podgo. Like I said, we need to navigate over to the user set list. So I'm just going to press on this top knob here, and now you can see that we have our preset list here. Like I said, we're in the factory one right now, so we can see there's some familiar song names dialed up in here. I'm just going to head over now to the user set list. And as you can see, I already have a few presets put in here from previous live streams, but as I go down, we're just going to encounter a whole bunch of empty free space where we can write whatever we want. Cool. So let's go ahead and choose an empty preset here. Looks like we have a question in the comments. People who are having connection interrupted in HX Edit when connecting via USB. Gotcha. So I don't typically encounter that problem, but I do hear about it occasionally from customers. Make sure you're using a good USB cable, and also you don't want to be plugging into a hub. You want to try and go directly into a USB that's part of that computer there. Those are some tips that might help you. Otherwise, sometimes, there can be some computer driver issues you might have to sort out with support, but thank you for that question. Cool. All right, let's go ahead now and dive into our editor here and talk about what's going on in this preset and how we can build some different sounds here. So right now, if I was to play, we're not going to have any sound passing through the Podgo. Maybe hear my dry guitar there. That's because there's this effects loop on, so we just need to turn that off. That's one of the items that's always in the signal chain here, and it looks like we have a question from Master Joda here. Will Line 6 release an update that allows swapping the EQ for another block? I can't speak to whether that will ever happen, but right now that particular block is locked to the signal chain. So for those who are unfamiliar, there's a few things that are always going to be in your signal chain in Podgo, and basically what those are, oops, it looks like this is got cut off here. Let me fix that. Basically, you're always going to have a wah, a volume, an amp, a cab block, and an EQ. And then around that, you have 4 effects that you can place kind of wherever you want. So that's a little bit about the Podgo workflow, how another maybe view of how this might look. Once again, you always have your wah, volume, EQ, amp, cab, and effects loop in your signal chain. And then you have room to add 4 effects around that. And depending on how you place them determines whether they're going to be mono or stereo. So your filters, mods, delays, reverbs, if you throw those after your amp and cab, then they're going to be stereo. If you place them before or between the amp and cab, then you're going to have some mono sounds. So just a little bit of info on the Podgo workflow there. Let's head back to my editor and let's go ahead and start building this preset. So once again, this is just a blank factory preset. There's a few things that we're going to change here. Right away, this comes with this compressor on. I don't want to use that, so I'm going to take that out. And there is a bit of chamber reverb. I might just leave that for a little bit of sound. But let's head over to our amp block here. Clicking right on the amp block, you see it's just going to open up the model list. If I want to select the individual parameters, I'm just going to click on the name, US Deluxe Norm there. So this is like a Fender Deluxe normal channel style model here. And yeah, this is once again just the factory settings. Let's just hear how it sounds. Cool. We're going to change that amp, of course. Let's see, it looks like we have some other questions. Any news on the firmware? I'm assuming you're asking about 3.0. You'll know when it's out. I don't have anything to share with you, unfortunately. Jonathan Weir asks, I'm curious to ask if the digital output for Helix will be fixed so we can adjust that for using the AES cable with power cab, for example, instead of every preset. Let me reread that one again, make sure I got that corrected. Can it be adjusted so the ES cable... I'm not sure what you're asking with that one, John. The gain staging. Feel free, I might send you a DM after this just to make sure I know what you're talking about. I don't have the Helix in front of me. I know from that output menu there's some control you can do with the power cab. So a lot of times when it comes with Helix and power cab, it is a little bit of a balancing act, making sure your presets are coming out at the appropriate volume and you're getting, the right volume then from power cab. So sometimes it's a little battle with that. I know on the output block of Helix you can control the output and things like that. So I'll send you a message and see if we can't get that sorted. But anyways, let's head back to our Podgo editor now and just start building this preset here. So first thing I want to change out is this amp block. So I'm just going to click on the name of the amp to open up my model list. And I already have one in mind that I'm going to use for this session. So I'm going to scroll to the bottom here. And as we get to the bottom here, we're going to see all of our bass amp offerings, and we're also going to get into the Line 6 originals, if you will. And I'm going to choose this Line 6 Litigator Amp. If you're not familiar with this amp, it's basically Line 6's take on the Dumble style of amp. If you're unfamiliar with Dumble amps, they're boutique, highly sought after, very expensive amps, so very hard to get your hands on. Of course, all the amp models in here, we own a real world equivalent that the engineers break down and model, but a Dumble's so hard to find, and also each one is kind of tailored for the player that it was, sold to originally. So they all vary a little bit. So this is the collective knowledge of all the Line 6 engineers building, the best Dumble that they can. And the characteristics of this amp is it has a very dynamic clean tone, and as you turn up the drive or the gain on it, it starts to get this very liquid and smooth lead tone. So it's a really sought after sound. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these parameters and what we can dive into here. So the first set of parameters I want to discuss is going to be the drive, our EQ section. So here we have a bass, mid, and treble, and then finally the presence. So let's head back to that PowerPoint real quick. I have some other things I want to show you there just to break it down for you. So this is the controls we'd find on page 1. Page 1 being if we're looking at the actual Podgo screen on the unit. But the drive is going to be the preamp, gain, and distortion. So this is where a lot of the tone color from the amp happens, is in this preamp stage. And of course the drive is going to affect the overall gain distortion. You're also going to get some volume out of this too. So if we just head back to my editor now, and we have our drive set near the middle here at a 4, and this is the tone we're dealing with. It's actually not too bad sounding for stock settings, but as we come down on that drive, we can clean it up. And as we come back up, it's going to really start to saturate. So that's one way we start shaping our tone on the amp model. And I'm just going to kind of set this near the middle, a little higher than what we have. After that, we have our EQ section, and this will always match the actual amp. So if you have a Vox model pulled up, you're not going to have the mid control, you'll have the cut, right? But basically, this lets you tone shape this first preamp stage. So maybe if I want a little more bass and mids in there, sounding pretty cool there. Then we get to our presence. This now we're starting to get into the power amp section of the amp. So the presence controls, it basically boosts the highs and upper mids at the power amp section. Yeah, And it's just a high frequency shelving boost. It really is reactive when you're playing with more distorted or overdriven amp models. It can change the way those higher frequencies break up. It can make them sound a little wilder even. So here's with the presence at 0. If we just start coming up on that. It can be a subtle thing, and the experience is going to vary on each different amp model, but hopefully you can hear how that presence starts to bring out some of that high end a little bit more. Pretty cool stuff. Let's take a look back at the comments real quick. Master Joda, can we download this PowerPoint presentation anywhere? I don't have it anywhere available for download, but if there's any slides that you want me to re-throw up on the screen for you to do screen grabs or anything like that, just ask and I can put those back up. I have a few more I'm going to show you as well. And then Jonathan Weir, once again, okay, thank you. Talking about the global settings digital output control. Just reading through here. Yeah, I'll send you a message on that, Jonathan, and we'll see if we can get that sorted. Thanks for that question. All right, so we've kind of gone through these first set of amp controls here, the drive, how the EQ section and presence start to affect your amp tone. Let's check out a few more things here. So as we move along, we're going to head to amp controls page 2. Matt Klein, I forgot what you said about 3.0 coming out. What was the date you said? I didn't say any date. I don't have any date to offer. Sorry about that. It'll be out when it's out. Cool. So amp controls page 2 here. We're starting with the channel volume, which affects the block overall volume without changing the tone. This is what I say is the best place to start for leveling presets. So sometimes when you're making different presets using different amp models, maybe going between a clean and a dirty tone, you're going to find sometimes that you're going to have, volume disparities between those presets. And the channel volume on the amp is the best place to start because once again, that's affecting the overall volume of that particular block without affecting the tone. And then we get into some more power amp controls after that. So first we get into the master, and this works just like it would on an analog amp. It is the power amp's gain and distortion. So turning that up is going to cause, more volume, but also more gain, distortion, saturation. And master volume distortion is a bit different than the type of distortion we get from the preamp. The preamp distortion tends to be more smooth. I guess smoother is the word I was looking for there. But yeah, preamp distortion tends to be smoother than your master distortion. And how those react with each other will actually give you different flavors of gain. So seeing how the drive and the master kind of interact with each other are cool things to do when you're dialing in your tone. But let's get into these next parameters here. So these next parameters that have to deal with the power amp are really deep divey in the weeds type of things. And sometimes when I show these to people, they're like, wow, I didn't know guitar tone got this complicated. And it certainly doesn't have to be. I would say maybe 95% of the time, I really don't touch these 5 parameters. And out of these 5 parameters, there's maybe only 1 or 2 that I will actually touch. So starting with sag, the higher you go on the sag, the looser the feel, the more tube compression and a little bit of distortion you're going to get out of the amp model. If we think about players like Eddie Van Halen, he bought something to actually go between the amp and the wall outlet called a variac, dropped the voltage going into his amp, and created this sort of looser but yet more tube compressed type of sound. It's almost like an opposite thing happening there when you talk about looser and compression. And then as we go down on the sag there, we get a tighter response. I usually like to think, modern metal styles, very tight attack, very tight cutoff, obviously not going to want a lot of sag in that tone. So let's head back to the editor, just see how this affects our tone real quick here. Scroll down a bit so we can pull up our sag. All right, so now it's set right in the middle, and as we've been hearing, fairly tight tone, straight up the middle there. Let's see what happens as we come up on the sag. So I'm just going to play a few chords once again. If we turn our sag to 10 now, hopefully you can hear that low end sounds almost a bit muddy. It's not as clear, we don't have as much string separation, it's not as defined of a sound. But for lead style playing, it has a really nice spongy feel to it that's pretty fun to play with. So a lot of times tube amps, not not only the sound that we like, but also their feel that they give us, their interaction, things like that. So let's do the same thing now and turn the sag to 0. So hopefully you can hear now with the sag at 0, a lot tighter of a sound, especially when I'm playing those big open chords. When I go to the lead work though, it does feel a little stiffer. Maybe you're not hearing a huge tonal difference there, but I can feel it on my end feel-wise. Hopefully for the chords though, you can hear that difference. The Tone Shack says Doc equals full guitar ninja. Ah, that is the highest compliment I'll probably receive today. Thank you for that. Cool. Let's keep moving on here. Let's take a glance back at that PowerPoint and talk about the hum. Hum controls how much heat or hum interacts with your tone, and typically I'm going to leave this at the stock setting if not at 0. Once again, I was mentioning these 5 particular parameters are more in the weeds. You don't necessarily ever need to touch them to get a good guitar tone, and 95% of the time I'm not really messing with them. But hum is one of them you may mess with, especially on some amp models that are more vintage style. Sometimes there is a bit of hum that is part of that amp sound, and you may just want to take that out. You may want to increase it for effect. Basically, as you turn it up, you're just going to get more hum from the amplifier. Typically, you don't want that. As you turn it down, it gets better. And on this particular model, we don't get a lot out of the hum. Certain amp models you'll notice more. After that, we get the ripple. Ripple controls how much AC ripple interacts with your tone. So what that means is when you have an amp that's basically maxed out, working its hardest, full gain, full saturation, sometimes that power can bleed through the section. So there's usually capacitors that will filter all that sound out, but sometimes they just get so overrun that starts to bleed through the amp circuit, and you almost get like this ring modulated sort of distortion, broken amp tone. Typically not something you want, but sometimes maybe for effect you might want it. So once again, a control I typically just don't touch. I either leave it at the stock setting or I leave it at 0. One thing with this particular amp model though is the ripple does play a big role. As I turn it up, our amp actually starts to get hum and gets a lot noisier, so hopefully you can hear that background hum. I'm going to take that out now. But the ripple really affects this amp, and I've actually noticed that if I want to use this amp as sort of a cleaner sound, taking down like my master and my drive to clean it up, then I start to get hum too, and I could actually coax that out using the ripple. So different amps are really gonna, get different mileage out of these parameters. Let's keep diving along here, head back to the PowerPoint, hit the bias controls really quick. Higher bias values equals Class A operation, so typically that means more warmth, but less headroom, and increased distortion. It also means less dynamics. So remember earlier I was talking about these Dumble style amps, very touch sensitive. So when I play light, nice clean tone, and then I could get it to really break up just using my right hand and digging in. And then bias X changes how much bias, or excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself, how much bias changes when the amp is pushed hard. So lower for tighter settings, higher for more tube compression. I don't typically touch these parameters. Out of these 5 parameters, sag, hum, ripple, bias, bias X, I'll traditionally gravitate most towards the sag parameter for that feel control, and then bias a little bit if I need to change something up. But most of the time, like I said, I really don't touch these. Guitar playing doesn't need to be complicated, but I think it's totally awesome that we have these parameters to mess with in Helix. So let's head back to the editor, and let's just give this bias a listen real quick here. So I accidentally changed it. I believe it was at a 5 here. Sounding fine. And if I play really lightly here, maybe we can kind of get this going. Fairly clean, on the edge of breakup, but as I dig in with my right hand, hopefully you can hear that amp's pretty reactive. As I turn my bias up to 10 though, we're going to lose that reactive quality. So now it's going to be a little warmer, a little brighter. But playing light doesn't really make much of a difference as if I'm playing hard. So really interesting way you could shape an amp there. As I come down on my bias, we're going to get colder and more dynamic. So now if I play lightly, lot more touch reactive, lot more dynamic when we turn that bias down. So I usually leave it in the middle here. And once again, the mileage you will get out of these controls will vary on the amp model. I chose the Line 6 Litigator today because I know that these particular sag through bias X, these power amp controls, are very reactive on this amp model. Cool. So let's go ahead now and talk about some of the other things we can change here. We got 10 minutes left, folks, so if you have any questions, feel free to fire them off. Next, I'm going to talk about some of the things we can change on our cab model, and if there's time, I'll go through a few different effects and things like that as well. So once again, we pull this up, some parameters we're going to dive through, but let's say we just want to change our cab model to start with. I'm just going to click on the name. Usually an amp will be matched with its matching cab. In this case, since it's a Line 6 original model, there's actually no Litigator cab. It's just paired up with this Fender 1x12 cab here. But if I want to change it, I'm just going to click on the name. I could even choose a third-party impulse response. But let's say if I go from a 1x12 to something like a 4x12, jumping to this bigger cabinet is going to have a different sound. We're going to have more bass response. So a lot different of a sound than we were working with. A bit darker, it's just different. I actually kind of like that 112 sound, so let's just stick with that for the remainder. And let's start by talking about the different mics that we have to play with in here. So there's basically 3 different types of microphones inside. Podgo, HX, Helix, you're going to encounter the same ones. So the dynamic microphones tend to be a little bit more crisper, for lack of a better word, aggressive sounding. They capture that sort of side of the amplifier really well. As you move to the condenser, you're going to get more low and high ends, a bit more dynamic, a bit warmer sounding than the previous mic I mentioned. And then finally the ribbon out of these 3 choices, that's going to be the warmest of them all. And there's also lots of low end on here, typically also the darkest. So let's just go ahead and hear how these affect our tone real quick. Head back to the editor. Looks like we have another question. Cab models in Helix, are they fully digital or have something from IRs? That's a good question. So IRs are technically digital too, and the Helix cabinets are very similar to an impulse response, but they end up being a little more flexible. Inside of an impulse response, you'll have the cabinet, the speaker, the microphones, the room sound, and any post-processing is all in that file, and you can't change any of it basically. It's baked in. What's nice about the HX cabs is that if I want, I can change my microphone, I can change the distance, I can bring in early reflections. So they end up being a little more flexible than an IR. However, an IR can sometimes have more information, so you could have multiple mics and whatever post-processing an engineer added. So there's pros and cons to each of them. Hopefully that answers your question. Thank you for that. So once again, we're talking about our mics, and basically as we move from dynamic to condenser to ribbon, we tend to get darker, warmer, and add more bass, basically. So if we start with like the classic 57 condenser, very bright, crisp, aggressive sound as we head to a condenser. Bit of a darker sound. And then finally, if we head to the ribbon, that's going to be the darkest and most bass heavy of all. So microphones actually play a pretty big role in shaping your tone. You could definitely coax out some different, tonal characteristics just by dragging around that mic slider. Matt is asking, is there anything special I should look at when buying new studio monitors to use with the PodGo? Great question. I'd say the big thing that you want to make sure of is that they're basically full range, flat response. Full range meaning they give you the full frequency range or just about so. And flat response meaning that they don't add any sort of coloration to them. So a lot of, at-home consumer types of monitors. Maybe they have accentuated lows or highs or different things like that will end up affecting your tone. And if you decide to, take those tones somewhere else, they're going to end up sounding different because of that. So basically, you want studio monitors that end up being that full range, flat response type of thing. So hopefully that helps. Let's see, we're talking about the mics here. Next thing we have is the distance. So I'm going to go back to the default 160 ribbon here. I liked how that sounded. The distance, the closer the mic, the more bass response and less room sound you get. So we could just hear how this sounds, and I think it'll explain itself. When we put it all the way at 1 inch, basically right on that speaker grill, you have lots of low end, very present right there sound. Sounds fine. Let's go ahead and move that distance all the way out now to whole foot. Obviously you can hear it sounds a little bit farther away and we lose some of that bass response there. So I'm going to bring that back up. After that, we have the low cut and high cut. This is really great just for focusing an amp model if you find through your playback system, maybe the low end's a little too muddy or flabby, or the high end's just a little too shrill or harsh, and nothing you're really doing inside, the amp's EQ or with the mic is really taking care of that. So on the low end, depending on what you need, depending on if, the playing situation, you can go to different heights with this, but I usually don't go above 90 to 100. And on the high end, I usually will just leave it here. Most of these amp models sound pretty great to me. But sometimes, if it's too bright, you could bring it down to 5 kilohertz, even 4.5. I wouldn't go too much lower than that. It'll start to get pretty dark. But now whereas before, obviously there's some difference happening there, but it's not, killing our sound totally by going that low. Then we have early reflections, which is going to bring in some room sound, almost kind of like those uneven reverbs that you get, just when your amp first hits the wall, the sound that is, and comes back. Really, if you want a larger room sound or reverb sound, you're going to pull up an individual effect. But right now we've been hearing it at 0%. If I put it at 100, hopefully you can hear it's almost like a little bit of a slapback of reverb. Very short, very kind of muddied because we're getting all those uneven sort of reflections there. And then finally level. Sometimes, once again, when you're leveling a preset, you may go to the channel volume, especially on a clean one, turn it all the way up and find it's still not competing with some of your dirtier presets. I know for me, 9 times out of 10, I just need to go to the channel volume on that dirtier preset and bring it down. But sometimes what I'll actually end up doing is heading to the cab block here, and I think of this level just like I'm continuing that channel volume, and I could raise or lower that from here too, once again without affecting the tone, which is pretty important. Cool. All right, so we've covered quite a bit about amps, cabs, dialing them in. I talked about getting to a few effect things here, but it doesn't look like we're going to get to that today. Basically, I just wanted to go over some basics, like if you pull up a delay, you can change your note values between milliseconds and, quarter note, eighth note, dotted rhythms just by clicking this little clock on here. You could do that with, your modulations, anything that has a rate or time parameter built into it. All right. And Brewberry1 says the stock cabs, underrated versatility. Yes, absolutely. There's so much you can do with those stock cabs, just changing the microphones, messing with this distance, early reflections. You really have a lot more power to dial in your tone to your taste. Of course, though, there are some great sounding IRs out there, so I encourage you to experiment. But I want to thank everybody for hanging out today for the half hour. It was a lot of fun. I know we'll be back next week at the same time, same place, talking all things PodGo in Line 6. So, once again, thank you all for hanging out, and I will catch you next time. Cheers, and stay safe.